I'm pleased to introduce David Eagleman. He has over 100 academic publications, several books, including the New York Times bestseller Incognito and the imaginative Sum. He is the writer and presenter of the PBS series The Brain with David Eagleman. He's an adjunct professor at Stanford where he teaches brain plasticity. Brain plasticity is the topic of his current book, Livewired, which releases today and we'll talk about. Now I'd like to welcome David Eagleman.
Hello. Thanks for having me here, David.
Yeah. You start the book with a quote by Martin Heidegger. What's the quote and why is it one of your favorite quotes?
Yeah, the quote is, "Every man is born as many men, but dies as one." And that has always struck me as a very interesting quotation from the point of view of brain plasticity, which is the thing I study and care a lot about. Because when we're born into the world, we have so much potential, so many different directions that we could go. And what happens is our brains are shaped by all the experiences around us, or the language we're exposed to, the culture, the system of beliefs we're exposed to, the technologies around us, and so on. And this is the great trick that Mother Nature discovered with human brains in particular, is this issue of, instead of pre-programming everything so the brain drops out ready to go, instead build a brain that is half-baked and then stick it out in the world and let the world modify it and shape it. And it turns out that idea, that trick of Mother Nature, was enormously successful. As humans, we've taken over every corner of the planet now and cured smallpox and made the internet and bounded off the planet and so on. So it's a very successful trick. And this is what I loved about the Heidegger quotation, was the issue of you drop into the world and you're not yet formed, and you can go a lot of places, but you end up, the day that you die, you are exactly you.
Interesting. How would you describe the brain's model for how it handles inputs?
Well, generally the story, the goal of the brain is to build an internal model of the outside world. Why? Because the brain is locked in silence and darkness inside the skull. It doesn't know what the heck's going on out there. It's just trying to figure out what to do and what all the spikes coming in mean, and how it can control its body, and how what it does with its body changes the spikes that then come in. That's all it's trying to do. So it's building a model of the world, and that is its main goal. And in a sense, the reason it's doing this is so that it can make good predictions. In other words, you try to get a model of the world so that you can guess ahead about what's going on next. And when a brain does this really well, it burns that all the way down into the circuitry of the brain so that it is part of the hardware, so that it can perform efficiently and rapidly in the world. So just as a side note, if you look at an amateur doing whatever, let's say playing Tetris or playing soccer or whatever, when you look at an amateur's brain and measure the activity, it's on fire with activity. There's lots of stuff going on. But when you look at a pro, their brains are almost silent. They're just running through the routines because they've burned into the hardware. Now, obviously, the pro is much, much better than the amateur. So it is surprising that they have so little brain activity. But the point is, they have crafted their machinery to be a pro at the task in question.
Yeah, I think at one point you talk about the movie The Matrix and how they download skills. When could we expect this to happen, potentially?
Never. So the reason being that that'll never happen is that the way that you learn to do something is predicated upon everything else that you've ever learned. So let's say, David, that you and I go and take helicopter lessons. Well, I grew up in New Mexico, so I'm encoding that as, oh, I see, it's like a horse, and I have to do it the way that I rode a horse as a kid. And you know, wherever you grow up, maybe you say, oh, I see, it's like a motorcycle, but it's this thing that I'm doing here. But the way we learn something new has everything to do with who we are, where we've been. And so that's why the idea of saying, oh, let's download helicopter skills into your brain or my brain, it would be completely different. Obviously, just by way of background, you have 86 billion neurons. Each one of these has about 10,000 connections with its neighbors. So you have, like 0.2 quadrillion connections, and it's an enormous system. And what you would have to do is do a real system identification first to understand, oh, here's David Levin's brain. Here's everything that went into shaping it exactly like it is. Oh, here's David Eagleman's brain. Here's everything that went shaping it like it is. Then maybe you could download some sort of skill, but certainly there'd be no generic manual for just doing an upload. Yeah.
Right. You also describe the model. You talk about this pH model of evolution. What is that?
Yeah, so this is what I've come to build over the last 10 years or so. Is I think that all of our receptors that we care about, like our eyes, our nose, our mouth, our ears, all these receptors that we have for picking up sensory information, they are just plug-and-play devices, meaning that the brain figures out the principles of brain operation once and says, okay, great. Whatever you plug in, I'll just figure out what to do with the spikes and I'm good to go. And pH stands for potato head, because the idea is that I think all these things can just get plugged in. So these are specialized devices for capturing photons. This is for capturing air compression waves, mixtures of molecules, pressure on the fingertips, this kind of thing. But when you look across the animal kingdom, what you find are all sorts of other amazing things, like picking up on infrared or picking up on electrical fields or magnetic fields or things like that. And so when I started looking at this, I thought, wait, does Mother Nature have to reinvent the brain every time to say, okay, I'm plugging electroreceptors into this creature, so now I have to do something completely different. I'm plugging, magnetic reception of the planet's field into this creature. So do I need to redo the brain? And what I realized is that's not at all what it is. It's just like a Mr. Potato Head. You just plug in whatever peripheral devices that you want to. And now this has been shown that you can take something like an infrared light detector and plug it into a mouse's brain, and then give the mouse a task where it needs to, detect and operate on the infrared light to get the right answer. And the mouse has no problem incorporating a new sense into it. In the same way, you can take, monkeys and engineer a new color photoreceptor so that the monkeys now have color vision like we do. And, no problem. Whatever input goes in, they just figure out how to use it.
But isn't there, I guess historically, I've always heard there's a part of my brain back here that deals with visual things and it's specialized for that. How does that fit in with this idea?
So this is the textbook model, is that you look at a brain, this is the occipital cortex back here, it's about vision. But that textbook model is limited, because when a person is born blind, that whole area becomes involved in touch and hearing and math problems and memorizing vocabulary words and so on. This system is completely flexible. It doesn't let any of the real estate lie fallow. And so this is the important thing to understand about the brain. And the reason that I called the book Live Wired is because, all of us, here in Silicon Valley and everywhere else are obsessed with this idea of hardware and software. But the brain is something different. It's what I call liveware. And it's just a completely different kind of beast, where it is constantly reconfiguring itself to optimize its function in the world. It's not like you got hardware and running software on top of it. It's that you're actually changing the hardware at all points. And by the way, what I do at the end of the book is, I talk about, there's actually a whole range of time scales that are essentially daisy chained together, so that some changes are happening really fast and others are happening more slowly, and others require even more evidence, all the way down. At the lowest levels, we have things like changes to the expression of genes with the epigenome. But at the top level, you have changes in biochemical cascades, and then changes in synaptic connection strength, and so on. But this is the issue: is it's a completely live wired system.
Yeah, in fact, in that same area, I think you were talking about how the brain is similar to civilization. How is it similar to civilization?
Well, that's interesting. So I use a lot of metaphors in the book as they're helpful, but where I compare the brain to, I think I compare it to a city a lot in several senses, actually. One is, first of all, there's always this notion that people have when they first come into neuroscience where they think, oh, I'm going to find the area of the brain that's involved in this or this, like, oh, this is the area that's involved in generosity and this is involved in, Schadenfreude or whatever. But in fact, it's nothing like that. I mean, although we can use brain imaging and sometimes we can see particular areas coming online as being more active than others, everything should be thought of as a giant distributed network. So the reason I compare this to a city is, imagine that I looked at the city of New York and I said, okay, so where exactly is the economy of the city? There is no spot where the economy exists. It is the interaction of all of the pieces and parts. The economy is an emergent property out of that. And yes, I might be able to, if I did the equivalent of a city scanner, I might be able to say, oh yeah, where all these tall buildings are, that's where the economy is. But sort of, that's just where a lot of the banking is more dense. But in fact, it's about the interaction of all the pieces and parts that really matters. And so that's one way I use the city analogy. The second way that's, I think, really important is when you look at the way a brain changes through time, it's similar to the way a city changes, which is to say, I just recently found a map of San Francisco from 1906. And what you see is that a lot of the roads, the main arteries and so on are exactly the same, most of them, in fact. But the city itself looks completely different. But when you look at it, you see that the architecture that got laid down at the beginning, everything has to build on that and around that. And so this is, it's just a good analogy because we can all understand cities really easily. It's a good analogy to think about, okay, that's what brains do. Their first years are critically important in terms of where they go, which path they follow, and then other things can get written on top of that.
Yeah, so also with related to this whole thing about the plug and play nature of the brain, you talk about how we could plug in potentially not only Mother Nature plugging in extra peripherals, but we ourselves could do that. How have you explored this?
Yeah, well, so here's the thing. Going back to the potato head model, the thing that struck me was, if the brain is so good at interpreting whatever signals are in there, and not just interpreting, but understanding the correlations, as in, oh, I see, this is happening at the same time as that, or when I do this action, that tends to occur. This is how we learned how to hear and see all these things when we were infants. Of course, you don't remember having to learn how to use your ear or your eyes. But of course, for your brain that just dropped into the world, it doesn't know what all these spikes mean. Again, the brain being in the vault of darkness, all it sees is spikes coming in here. It doesn't know those are conversions from photons. It sees spikes coming in here. It doesn't know that's conversions of air compression waves vibrating your eardrum. All it knows is, oh, there's all these spikes running around. But what brains are really talented at is understanding, okay, here's how to extract patterns and eventually how to assign meaning to that. And eventually how to construct this, your whole subjective world with all of its colors. And yeah, colors don't actually exist in the outside world. All you have is electromagnetic radiation of different wavelengths and so on. But anyway, so brains are really good at extracting data like this. And so one of the things I started chewing on some years ago is, could we actually build what's called sensory substitution, where, for example, for people who are deaf, we capture sound and turn it into patterns of vibration on the skin. So my student, Scott Novick, and I built a vest covered in vibratory motors, like the little buzzer on your cell phone, and it captures sound and turns it into patterns of vibration on the skin. And people who didn't have any hearing, and by the way, there are 220 genetic reasons why you can lose hearing, they could come to understand the auditory world through their vest. So that was a few years ago. And what we did is spun a company off from my lab called Neosensory. And what we've done now is shrink this down to the size of a wristband. So the wristband has motors in the band. And when there's sound in the world, that sound is getting captured in microphones here and turned into patterns of vibration on the skin. And so we now have this on wrists all over the world, and people who have hearing loss can understand what is going on in the world. They say, oh, there's a dog barking, there's a baby crying, this sort of thing. And what's kind of amazing is, the very first day that somebody puts it on, they say, oh, I'm feeling some buzzing, and they look around, they say, oh, there's a dog, moving its mouth, so it must be a dog barking. But it's a cognitive translation to understand what the thing is. But a few months into it, it's not that way anymore. They say, oh, there's a dog barking somewhere, but they don't think, oh, there's a buzzing on my wrist, and that's how the information is going and climbing up my spinal cord into my brain. It's just a direct perceptual experience, exactly like your ears. You are hearing me speak. You're not thinking, oh, okay, so let's see, my eardrum is vibrating, and that's getting broken up into frequencies in my inner ear. And okay, he must have said this word. Instead, you just feel like you're hearing my voice. It's the same process that happens with the wristband, which is called buzz.
And I think you also talked about one story where somebody had lost a sense, and by augmenting it, you found that they hadn't lost the sense completely, and it was able to help them tune into it a little bit better.
Oh yeah, this is actually a common story in the world of sensory substitution, is that we have little whispers of signals quite often that we can't operate on or do anything about. But if you have some external device that sort of confirms the signal, then you strengthen up your notion of, how to use that little whisper of a signal. So for example, some years ago, some colleagues of mine built this thing for people with balance problems, where it just, it looks at how you're balancing in the world and gives you feedback. For example, you can give feedback directly on the tongue, just because the tongue is a useful area. It's wet and it's electrically conductive. So they give people feedback. But the interesting part was, after they took the device off, after they used it for several days and they took it off, then they were better at balance. And you find this with many things. For example, some other colleagues of mine built many years ago a belt that goes around the waist, and it's ringed with vibratory motors, and it buzzes in the direction of north, magnetic north. So if north is over there, then I feel the buzzing on this part of me, and as I turn, I feel the buzzing move around me accordingly, so that I always know where north is. And it turns out, again, that after people took the belt off, after wearing it for a week, they were just generally better at knowing where north was, which indicates a suspicion that we've long had in biology, which is that we've got just like the littlest capacity to pick up on the magnetic field of the earth. Like many animals, cows, birds, insects, they all do it regularly, but humans don't do it so well. But it turns out that if you strengthen and confirm those signals, you can do it better.
Interesting. I'm going to go on a small tangent, but one thing I really liked about the book was how you go and you ask various questions at times that seem kind of perplexing and relate it back to being live wired, and then kind of explain how that works. I suppose one of those aspects was how we can get rid of an accent if we're exposed to a language at a certain time, and even going back further from that, I'll relate it to how babies seem much more to have much more plasticity. I don't know if that's the right word, but
yeah,
would it be good for us to have that level? Like, could we revert to that level, and what would it imply?
I'll tell you the truth. When people start thinking about brain plasticity, one of the areas they often go is thinking, I'm getting older. Wouldn't it be great to have the plasticity of a young brain again? I actually think that's a philosophically difficult place to go. And here's why. It's because what the brain is fundamentally trying to do is make its model of the world so it can function efficiently in the world. And so that means you learn the language, you learn how people behave, you learn how to act in the world, how to talk to your boss, how to talk to your employees. You learn all these things through time with experience. So now let's say I came to you and I said, hey, David, we've just invented something new in my lab. This will take you back to the plasticity of an infant. Would you like it? The fact is, if you took it, you would be gone. I mean, you would be completely flexible again. You could learn Chinese easily. You could learn a new world in various ways. But everything that you know and you remember and your loved ones and your memories of your childhood, all that would be gone if we made you super plastic again. So in other words, the point of cementing the brain into place through time is to make it so it's got a good model of the world. And it's, of course, all your memories. It is you. It's what we think of as you. And so I don't actually think that we'd want to go back to having a lot of plasticity. Now, that said, it turns out one of the most important things for taking care of your brain, none of us have to worry about this yet, but when it comes time to retire, one of the most important things about taking care of the brain is making sure that you keep it active. And this is something that a lot of people, as you know, we all know, when people retire, their lives shrink, and often they, you know, have fewer and fewer friends and fewer things that they're doing. And what happens is this is really, really bad for the brain. The good thing for the brain is to constantly challenge it, because when you do that, even as parts of the brain are degenerating physically, you are building new roadways, you're making new connections. And just as a side note, you know, there's this study that's been going on for decades that has found that people who stay cognitively active to their last days, you know, for example, they're living with a bunch of other people and they're constantly having things and deep people and so on, many of them have Alzheimer's disease, but it wasn't even known when they were alive. In other words, they had none of the cognitive deficits, but at autopsy, it was discovered, oh, this person had Alzheimer's. And the reason is that even as Alzheimer's was physically chewing up their brain, they were building these new pathways, these new roadways between A and B.
Right. One of the things that I think you've commented that you might be overly known for is your advisory capacity on Westworld. And in there, they featured some things like similar to what you've been talking about. What aspect did you play in advising them there?
Yeah, well, you know, we have conversations about free will and consciousness and could a robot be conscious, stuff like that. But the thing I did there is I took our vest and I suggested that they put it in the show, which they did. So in the show, the military contractors drop into Westworld to deal with the bad robots and feel the location of the robot. So if there's one over here, then you feel it there. If there's one, you know, over on the other side of the wall over here, then you feel a buzzing there. And so this is a way for them to have spatial awareness of these geotag hosts. Now, we've done this in real life too with things like blindness. So we take people who are blind, and actually this is an experiment we did at Google, because at one building in Google anyway, there's LiDAR set up in the building so that you can know the location of everybody who's moving around. So we tapped into that data stream and fed it into the vest so that if you are a blind person, you know, oh, okay, here's somebody, you know, way up there on my left, and here's someone over here, and there's a person 500 yards behind me over there, and oh, the person behind me is getting closer and closer. And what's amazing about spatial awareness is that there's no learning curve. People immediately got it. They understood, oh, okay, there's someone there. And presumably it's because they could correlate that with what they were hearing. So they knew, okay, I get what's going on here. But that was very cool. One of the things we're working on now in Neosensory, the company, is figuring out how to make it so that you don't need LiDAR, which is very expensive and big pain to do. You know, how we can do this with, you know, using mapping directly with a worn cell phone.
Right. I'll go for one more question, then we'll probably start mixing in some audience questions. So if y'all have questions, make sure to ask them there. Let's see. In your book, you also say, I like this quote from you. The thrill of life is not about who we are, but about who we are in the process of becoming. And how do you see that this relates to the whole concept of live wired and so on?
Yeah, I mean, you know, here's the analogy is that, you know, typically when you look at a textbook on the brain, it says, okay, here's a map of the brain, vision, hearing, touch, so on. But that's actually not at all what's magical about the brain. What's magical is the way that it is constantly changing itself based on every new memory, based on what it's trying to achieve in the world. I mean, my brain and your brain are different than they were when we began this conversation, because we've had interaction on these issues, and so we're able to. Our brains are changing so that now we remember stuff. So just as an example, I hadn't met you before today, but when I, a year from now, see you on the sidewalk somewhere, I'll say, "Hey, David, how are you?" Why? Because there's been a physical change in the structure of my brain that encoded your face and your name and this event. And that physically changed such that a year from now, I will be able to just pull that up right away.
Yeah. So now I think we'll take a question that Grace mentioned to us, and I'll start to read it. Hopefully it'll appear on the screen shortly. Grace Hoyt, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly, said, if your world is shrinking or less social interaction is bad for your brain, how might the whole situation with COVID and being stuck at home be collectively impacting all of our brains?
So it's a great question, Grace. I'll tell you, I have some, I have a little bit of optimism about this, actually, which is to say, remember I mentioned that the whole idea about brains is to make an internal model so it can function efficiently in the world. What has happened with COVID and the lockdown is that all of us have been kicked off of the path of least resistance. We have for decades been shaping our brains to function in the world in a particular way. And, for most of us, it's been successful, and we've made friends and we've had successes in business and whatever. And all of a sudden, everything's different. The reason this is good, actually, despite all the stress and anxiety that comes with it, is because we are forced to be a little bit more creative now. We're forced to get off the hamster wheel and rethink everything in our lives. I mean, we've all experienced this in the last several months, where everything about the way we've done stuff, we have to think new ways and so on. Now, this is not to minimize how lousy this time is in so many ways, including the fact that, we're extremely social creatures and we're missing the ability to meet with people and shake their hands and hug them and be with them and stuff. So that, that part stinks. But the good news from the point of view of brain plasticity is simply that we have presented ourselves with novel challenges. And this is, when I was mentioning earlier about people when they retire, the whole key is novel challenges. The key, by the way, if you have a parent or a grandparent who's retired and you're worried about them, just make sure they're constantly climbing new hills, facing new challenges. For what I mean is, if they take on Sudoku, great. But as soon as they get good at Sudoku, make sure they leave that and do something else. As soon as they get good at that, they do something else. The whole point is to stay constantly challenged. That's how your brain retains plasticity.
Interesting. Any other audience questions? Give a moment. And if not, I'll just jump to one of mine. Or I'll just pick out one at random, actually.
David, there's one on the screen.
Oh, here we go. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Ferguson, is brain plasticity higher when we're younger? Related to what we were talking about earlier, what are the prospects for drugs or other treatments to increase the plasticity?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say the same thing I said before, which is that yes, brains are very plastic when they're young, and they get less and less so with time. But I think you probably wouldn't want a drug that gives you massive brain plasticity, because although it might lead to, I guess the hope would be it leads to some breakthrough where you realize, oh, I don't have to be this way anymore. I can be this way instead. And that would be terrific. It would be like taking the city of San Francisco and suddenly having a big earthquake so that you could remake some of the roads. But the problem is, are you anymore? Or have you lost yourself for the benefit of being totally plastic again?
Yeah, I remember at one point you had this diagram, I think it was with fashion and all sorts of things, and how they have different rates of change and so on, and how it kind of mirrors.
Yeah, this is a concept from Stuart Brand about pace layers, where he said, when you look at a city, what you find is, some things change fast, like fashion. Other things change more slowly, like issues of governance. In between, you have the buildings that are there. Oh, that's a restaurant. Now it's a shopping, whatever. All the way down to nature. So you have things that are changing fast in the city, all the way to things that are changing very slowly. And it's the interaction of all these layers that actually matters, that defines what's going on. And I loved this idea of pace layering. And so I've taken it over to the brain, and I talk about this neural pace layering, where you've got all these different speeds that are all interacting. And that's by the way, what explains a lot of very otherwise mysterious things about the brain. I'll give you just one example, which is that older memories are more stable than younger memories. And that's a rule of neurology called Ribot's law, but it's very weird because there's nothing else that operates that way. It's not like, at a big corporation like Google, that older things that happened a long time ago are somehow more stable in institutional memory than things happening now. But the reason is that the older a memory is, the more it works its way down this daisy chain into really hard-coded stuff. And this is why, by the way, often when people die, when they're on their deathbed, they end up speaking in the language that they grew up in. Like Albert Einstein, his last words, no one knows what they are because he was speaking in German and the night nurse didn't speak German. But this is a common thing for people to sort of revert to where they were as children at the end of their lives.
We'll take another question. There you go. Timur, does drinking alcohol kill brain cells? If so, can your brain respond in a way that the dead cells will not impact a person's brain function significantly over time?
Yes. Yes, drinking kills brain cells, but lots of things kill brain cells. If you hit your head on the wall, or if you just live and age, brain cells are dying all the time. But yes, this is exactly the point of brain plasticity, is the more you're challenging yourself and practicing things and trying things out, you're building new roadways, new connections, such that when brain cells die, you don't have a cognitive deficit as a result. Next question. I see lots of questions coming in the comments channel. So okay, Grace. Any thoughts on virtual versus physical interaction and impact on our brains? Yeah, we are so deeply wired for physical interaction, and there's so many things we get from physical interaction, like, seeing people's, their body language and the way they lean forward, and, going on a walk with somebody to get coffee. And so all these things we're missing. Virtual interaction, as much as we all don't love this sort of thing, it is pretty incredible. Think if this particular virus had hit 25 years ago, we wouldn't have any of this. We wouldn't be online. We wouldn't have this going on. So this is a million times better than not having virtual interaction, because what we would be is just locked down in our homes. There would be a piece of paper taped to your door that says "Stay in your home," issue of the local government, and then you'd just be sitting there lonely. So this is a lot better.
Yeah.
All right, is the next question going to magically appear on the screen here? Okay, great. Hasu, what are some of the best ways to challenge your brain to keep it healthy with age? Look, the fact is that for most of us at the age we are now, we don't have too much trouble with it. One thing that I do just because I think it's useful for the brain is I always do things like I'll brush my teeth with my other hand, or I will always, back in the day when we used to drive, I always try driving a different route home from work at nighttime so that I see something different, because otherwise your life shrinks where you're always driving the same route and you become an unconscious automated zombie on your drive home. I try shaving with my other hand in the days of safety razors. That's not so bad to do. All these things like that, just to try to seek novelty. So at this age, it's not that big of a problem. But as you get older and older, it's more and more important to take on anything where you think, well, I haven't done that. My reaction is to not go there because I don't know how to do that. It's important to recognize those moments, say, okay, no, I'm definitely doing that. I'm definitely going for that thing. Okay, next question. Dave, extremely interested to hear if you've done any work around sensory addition using VR. Any experiments involving sensory swapping? Okay, super cool question. So let me say a couple things. So in the book Live Wired, I talk about sensory substitution, which is where you take, let's say, a missing sense and you feed it into a different part of the body. But then there's also sensory expansion, which is where you come to expand senses that you already have. For example, getting to see infrared or ultraviolet and have a direct perceptual experience of that. That's something that we've done, or we're doing things now with expanding your sense of smell so that you've got an artificial molecular detector and you can feel all kinds of other smells, so you're more like a dog. And then there's sensory addition, which is adding completely new senses on, like a direct perceptual experience of the stock market or of Twitter or things like that. So I mentioned that by way of background because that was part of your question. But as far as VR goes, we have done something very cool there. We've built, for example, a couple of wristbands where as you're interacting in VR or AR, you're feeling the location of things. So let's say this is a virtual coffee cup. As my wrist, as my hand's over here, I'm feeling it on this side, and as I get closer, bzz, bzz, and then I know when I've grabbed it, and then I get bzz, special signals, and I can pull it and pinch and zoom and stuff like that. And that ends up being super helpful for people in VR and AR because sometimes it's a little hard to tell the depth of something or exactly where a virtual object is. And so it's really helpful to be able to do that. We have also built vests that we used in multi-person VR so that you can feel another person. So for example, if I see you in VR and we're standing on the surface of Mars or something, I say, hey, and I clap your shoulder, you feel that. You feel the interaction. And so we did this, there's a company called High Fidelity here that does social VR where lots of people are in the same VR world. So we hooked up vests with that and everyone can actually feel everyone. So it's the next level of VR that way. Okay.
Next question.
Okay, Heather, have you done any work on looking at how to improve a person's ability to produce coherent output? Speech for a stroke victim. Unfortunately, no. We are only doing input with the, with this. We're passing in new information streams. How to get something out is a very difficult challenge, and the reason is, for example, with Broca's aphasia, there's a lesion, in a particular area of the brain that takes all the input and all the what you want to say and so on, and it has the right circuitry to put that all together and translate it into a motor movement of the mouth or of the hands. And the problem is that such sophisticated circuitry, we don't know how to build that. So that is currently an unsolved question. Neuroscience is full of unsolved questions. So for anyone who's interested in going into neuroscience, that is one of the great questions: is how can you actually get the information out of there? One thing that people are doing is putting what's called ECOG. It's like electroencephalography on the surface of the skull, but it's on the surface of the brain. You actually open a little hole in the skull. You have these electrodes right on the surface of the brain, and you can actually do some pretty good decoding about what somebody is saying to themselves internally. And so people are exploring this idea of, can you now translate that into just putting that out on a speaker? Next question. Lauren, I read that a significant amount of neurotransmitters actually originate in other organs in the body, challenging the mind-body division. Can you speak to the idea that our entire body thinks? Yeah, here's my take on that. The brain is the densest representation of you. And the reason we know that is because if you damage part of your body, like let's say you lose part of a finger in a car accident, you'll be really sad about that, but you won't be any different as a person. But if you damage an equivalently sized chunk of brain tissue, that can change you entirely. That can change your decision-making, your risk aversion, your ability to recognize animals or see colors or understand music or 100 other things. And so that's how we know that this matters in a way that some of this other stuff isn't quite as important. I mean, we can replace your heart with an artificial heart. You're exactly the same person. So the metaphor, I think, to think about this is like the city, and this is like the, the greater metropolitan area of the city. So most everything's happening in New York, And, do the suburbs matter? Yeah, a little bit. There's some produce that you get from the suburbs, and that does matter for sure. But it wouldn't put the suburbs on an equivalent standing with the city. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, just a kind of follow-up, not completely, but one thing when you're talking about the inputs from all your senses feeding into the brain just as signals, it kind of makes one curious about, like, why do we experience touch as one thing and taste as another and smell as another?
So
Why?
Yes. So I devote a whole chunk of the book to this question because I am fascinated by this question. I mean, if I showed you a chunk of brain, let's say I had I cut a hole in a skull somewhere, and I showed you a chunk of brain tissue, and I had some magical microscope that could let us see all the spikes running around. And I said to you, okay, David, are we looking at visual cortex or auditory cortex or somatosensory or something else? You couldn't tell me. I couldn't tell you. As a professional neuroscientist, I would have no idea. Why? Because every place in the brain looks the same. Why? Because it is the same. If you look at the cortex, the wrinkly outer bit of the brain, it's the same 6 layers everywhere. I mean, it's a one-trick pony that's really, really good at taking whatever data cable you plug into it and saying, okay, I'm going to extract the important things out of this. And so, so then the question is, why would I never confuse hearing with vision, with smell, with touch? I mean, these all feel completely different. So what I hypothesize in the book is this has to do with the structure of the data. What I mean is, vision is you've got these two-dimensional sheets on the your retinas, the back of your eyes. So the visual information is coming in a very particular way. Hearing, on the other hand, is a one-dimensional signal that's impinging on your eardrum. So you have 2 of these one-dimensional signals. Pressure and touch and itch and so on. These are multidimensional signals that are coming in a different way and so on. All these things have very different structures to them. And I suspect that's what defines the qualia, the internal subjective experience. And what's very weird, and we'll know more about this in probably a year from now, or maybe less, is as we feed new senses into people through the neosensory buzz or through the vest, the question is, will you develop a new sense that is not hearing or touch or taste or smell, but it's something else? And of course, it's impossible to imagine what it would be like to have another feeling. In the same way as if I said to you, imagine a new color. So, just really try to imagine a new color. And what you find is that it's impossible. It's impossible to do because the fence line of our qualia is so tight, we can't step outside of it. But the interesting part is, if we actually developed a new sense, it would feel like a new color, feel like a new sense of some sort. And the weird part is you couldn't communicate it to people. If you said, oh, it's like this or that, or no one would understand you, even if they try to pretend that they're understanding you. It's like if you try to explain vision to a blind friend of yours, your friend might pretend to understand you at some point, but fundamentally she cannot, because she's never experienced vision. And so there's no way to understand what it is like to capture photons from a distance and so on. Just like if you try to explain purpleness to a person who's colorblind, there's no amount of academic description that'll ever explain it to them. So, okay. Next question. Okay, Sanjit. Do different people see colors differently? To be clear, if we could switch over to their POV, would we see the same thing that we call red? Right. This is an old philosophical conundrum. Is what I call red the same as what you call red on the inside? Because the fact is that it doesn't, as long as we can transact and negotiate in the outside world, then it doesn't matter if my version of what red is totally different than yours. The answer is we don't have any reason to think that it is the same experience. And it's even worse than that. I mean, what I call vision and what you call vision might be really different. I mean, you might see the world upside down from the way I see the world. It doesn't matter. As long as we can transact and negotiate in the outside space, then it doesn't matter what our particular qualia are. So, this used to be, just a philosophical place where you get stuck. But one of the things my lab did for about 15, 20 years now is we've studied cases where people provably have different perception from one another. So, for example, synesthesia is it's a I don't want to call it a condition because there's nothing disadvantageous about it, but it's a different perceptual reality where people will, for example, they hear a sound and it makes them, puts a taste in their mouth, or they eat something and it puts a feeling on their fingertips, or so on. Their senses are mixed in a way, and the interesting part is provably they are having a different experience than you are. And we can study this. And one of the things we've been looking for in my lab is the genetic basis for this. In other words, what is the tiny little gene tweak that makes you have one reality and I have a different reality? And I think, and so far we haven't found it. We're getting closer. But I think once we start really understanding the genetic basis for, I call this perceptual genomics. Like, what is it that causes us to have slightly different reality? We might be able to make more progress on this question of the color red. Okay, next question. Josh, what is the current state of the art in the brain-computer interfaces? Is the Musk-Bask Neuralink a real thing? So I'll tell you. So I'm a big fan of what Neuralink is up to, but it's not what a lot of people think it is. So what they're doing is they've developed a way, instead of sticking electrodes into the brain, they've developed a way to sew electrodes into the brain in a way that you can get a lot more coverage. But of course, if you open a hole in the skull here, you're only getting coverage of this little area there. And of course, the coverage is still not anywhere near what you would actually need, because, with 86 billion neurons, to really understand something about the brain, what you want is to record from every neuron. But what you're getting instead is maybe, 100 or several hundred neurons activities with these electrode strips. But I actually do not think that is the future of brain-computer interfaces, and I'll tell you why. It's because there's always risk of infection and death on the operating table. And neurosurgeons are not going to do this just so that you can interface with your phone faster. So what Neuralink is doing is super useful for patients with Parkinson's, in some cases with extreme depression, other cases where putting some electrodes in can actually do some good. But it's not what a lot of people think it is, which is, we're someday we're all going to get this stuff sewn in our brain, and then we'll be able to, surf the internet, without having to do something. The fact is, consumers aren't going to go for it, and neurosurgeons aren't going to go for it. It's just not worth it. That's why, just as a personal thing, I put my money on non-invasive brain-machine interfaces, where you just, you take it on and off. It's a few $100, and that's, you get all the information in that way. Thanks for that question. Question, what is some ongoing research that you find interesting in areas of neuroscience, cognitive science outside your focus? I could sooner pick my favorite star from the sky. There's a lot of great stuff going on in the field of memory. In just about every disease state, there's really terrific research going on. I mean, a lot of people are kind of flummoxed by the fact that we haven't yet solved Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or things like that. But you know what? These are extraordinarily tough, complicated problems. One way to appreciate this sort of thing, I think, about how hard a problem this is just look up some stuff on, like what happens inside a single cell. So let's say you take a neuron in particular, the biochemical cascades going on and the genetic expression, the millions of proteins running around and interacting and so on. And of course, mathematicians and computer scientists make models of this and try to figure out what's going on, and they find certain motifs in there. But boy, is it complicated. And it's not like you can look at it and say, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. It's just doing blah. In fact, what it's doing is, as you could spend your entire life inside of a single cell trying to figure out what's going on. So I happen to love that stuff. That's not what my lab does, but I'm a fan at a distance of that stuff. I've had nerves cut during surgery, which hasn't regrown. I get phantom itching sometimes. Can you explain this? Yeah, this has to do with this issue that I mentioned before about how the brain has all these different time scales of change. So this is one of the things it's one of the theories that I stand up in Livewire, is that what happens when someone has phantom sensation is that the part of their brain, let's say their somatosensory cortex that cares about, what it's receiving from the body, that part actually changes fast and says, oh, I see, cut nerve, or, let's say an amputee has lost a hand or whatever thing is, like, okay, no problem. But deeper areas of the brain, more downstream from that, change more slowly. And so what happens is you have this conflict between the fast changing areas of the brain saying, oh, I see, that person has no hand anymore, or this nerve is gone, or whatever. But other parts of the brain still expect that those signals mean that it's talking about the hand, and they're much more slow to change. And that's where phantom sensation comes from, is the conflict of timescales. Thanks for that question.
Okay, we'll probably go for one more question.
Okay, Sandeep, where are we in regards to understanding what mindfulness does to the brain with respect to well-being? So I'll tell you, I have several colleagues who are studying mindfulness and meditation in particular. And the general story, if we distill all, 60 of these papers in the literature about this, the general story is, the brain is constantly monitoring the outside world, and it's monitoring the inside world. And what happens with expert meditators is they're just doing less of the outside world part, and they're able to turn things inward. So the experiment is, for example, if I snap in your ear, your auditory cortex becomes active, and that activity, percolates through a large swath of the brain. But if you're meditating and you're really doing it well, and I do that same sound, you see a little bit of activity in the auditory cortex, but it doesn't really spread throughout the brain. People instead are able to sort of keep that, it's monitoring the world and seeing what's going on all the time. How that maps onto well-being, I don't know. A lot of people have wonderful things to say about meditation, and it's clearly really useful as a stress reducer. Especially if you're scattered and so on, it allows you to quit monitoring every single thing and just calm down a bit. So it's clearly good in terms of that. Stress is clearly really bad for the brain, as in, I don't mean to stress you out with this, but it physically cavitates the brain. You actually get holes in brain tissue if you're under a lot of stress. And so anything that can be done to avoid that is a really useful thing.
I think we have time for one more question, and we'll wrap it up.
Terrific. Okay, how do you personally push your new learning pathways, and do your QS approach to see if it is still novel and becoming normalized? So I think I understand the question, but it's actually pretty easy to always make sure that you are challenging yourself, because you can just do an internal read on it, which is to say, oh, wow, is that something I don't know how to do? Is that something I feel uncomfortable with? If so, great, go for it. That's the signal you're looking for. If instead, let's just say that I'm really good at Sudoku, I know I'm good at Sudoku. When I see a new Sudoku puzzle, I might think, okay, well, that's fun, but I don't think I'm a little anxious about that. I'm a little scared about that. It's those signals to look for. When you find that, you say, great, that's what I'm going to go for, is the thing that I'm scared about and don't want to do. I think we have time for one more, David, but it's up to you.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. All right, you guys want to throw it on the screen? Okay, Ksenia, it would be interesting to hear your view on observing neurology jointly with 16 socionic psychotypes, as this forms lots of similarities between people of same type regardless of their development. I am so sorry, but I actually don't know what socionic psychotypes are. I can imagine that it is a way of dividing up the population. People have derived so many ways to do this sort of thing. About like, oh, these are the things you like, these are the ways you learn, and so on. The core way that information is processed. I see your other message now. Yeah. So yes, the main thing is brains are so different from one another. It's, when I saw the poster for that movie, The Martian, where you see Matt Damon standing on the planet all by himself, I thought, God, that, for better or worse, that is a good analogy for what it's like to have your own 3-pound cosmos. We're all, in a sense, on our own planets. Just like the question before about, do you see red the same way I see red? We all have very different brains. In part, this is genetically, but in large part, it's also because of different experiences growing up. We all go off on different Heideggerian pathways. And so, so it is no surprise that one can come up with different frameworks to say, all right, look, this is how we're going to divide people up into different categories. The fact is that things are probably more spectral than category based. But yes, so even though I don't know about socionics in particular, it is clear that the population of brains is very, very different, and you can impose fence lines in many places.
So I'll wrap it up. The book is Livewired. It's an interesting book. It comes with lots of interesting questions that you're like, how does that happen? But then it kind of explains it, like why Arnold has a accent, why people saw pink pages in the 80s, lots more questions and answers, how synesthesia can come about, possibly why we dream. Anyway, thank you so much for presenting to us today. Oh, and it comes with a ton of footnotes to explain things too. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us today and talking about your book.
Great. Thanks so much, David.